Okay, we're live. Chat is working. Everything seems to be in order today. Greetings, Stephanie. Greetings. Welcome, everybody. We'll be starting at 6. The connection may be a bit better from now on because we now have Starlinks up and running. I have to say it's a big improvement over what we had before. Oh, good. Hope everyone is well at Birken. Wow, good. I'm glad to see that you're all there together at Birken. That's nice.
It's 6 o'clock.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Okay, welcome everyone. And we finished last week. We finished the series on the Four Noble Truths, and rather than start a new series this week, I'm going to do a one-off on some general thoughts about reading the scriptures in translation and the pitfalls to watch out for. The Buddhist let's say the Theravada Buddhist scriptures are in Pali, which is an ancient Indian language. It was probably somewhat of an artificial language from the beginning. It's unlikely that it was a native language. It was more like a lingua franca, a sort of compromise between the different dialects. And these scriptures were not written down for a long time, several hundred years. So there's actually, and then they were written down in in the different Buddhist countries. So there is actually no alphabet that is native to Pali. It was entirely an oral language to begin with. And the scriptures that we have come down to us are in the different recensions in different alphabets. In Sri Lanka, there's the Sinhalese alphabet. In Thailand, there's the Siamese alphabet. In Burma or Myanmar, there's the Burmese alphabet. And these are all of quite different alphabets recording the same underlying phonetics. And it's only since the 19th century that we have the Pali text in the Roman alphabet, thanks to German and British scholars. And at that time, if you look at the Pali Text Society editions of the Romanized Pali, you'll see many, many footnotes, because there were very careful scholars who compared the three principal recensions, the Sinhalese, Burmese, and Siamese, and noted any discrepancies. So we have quite a good, thorough record, thanks to a lot of very diligent scholars. Then, beginning in the 19th century, the Pali texts were translated into European languages. Of course, they're also translated into Asian languages like Thai and Sinhalese, but we're primarily thinking, for the purposes of this discussion, about the European languages, principally English. German and English were the two languages they were first translated into, and some of the pioneering work was very good, but it was done from more of a linguistic perspective without any real deep understanding of the underlying meanings. So there are some oddities that crop up. For example, in the Vinaya texts, there is a rule for the monks that we're not supposed to consume anything that hasn't been offered directly to us, hand to hand, hata hatena. And the one or the two exceptions to this rule are the use of toothsticks and water. Toothsticks are a primitive form of toothbrush that's still used quite a bit in Thailand, where you take a piece of aromatic wood and you sharpen one end and pound the other to fibers, and you have like a toothpick on one end and a brush on the other. They're quite nice. But Pali has the linguistic characteristic of often putting related words into compounds. So there's a compound in Pali of three words, tooth, stick, and water, that reflects this exception. And it's kind of curious, almost comical. The English translator, I.B. Horner, who translated the Vinaya texts, put in a long footnote trying to figure out what this compound could possibly mean. Perhaps it means something like tree sap. A difficulty that could have been resolved very quickly if she'd had access to a practicing bhikkhu to discuss it with. And there's a lot of difficulties like that in the translation of the Vinaya text. That's a body of work that really needs an update in translation. In the suttas, we have had several iterations of translations of parts or all of the suttas, and we now have some very good translations. Particularly praiseworthy, I think, are the works by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and particularly in some of his later efforts like his translation of the Angutara, because he seems to be very gifted linguistically, and he's also in the meantime learned to read Chinese. And he in the footnotes he often compares the Pali text to what we have in the Chinese the agamas, which are Chinese translations of Sanskrit texts. So that is very useful for anyone trying to unravel the actual provenance of the texts. So we are gifted now with some very fine translations. They're probably about as good as they'll ever get, the translations of the principal Nikayas. But you still have to be aware that they are translations, and there are always problems in translation of anything, because no two languages are fully isomorphic. For those who don't know the meaning of the word isomorphic, it's a mathematical term when you have two sets that are composed of different elements, but they correspond one to one. Like let's say the numbers from 1 to 10 written in our standard script, or 1 to 10 written in Roman numerals, that they would be an isomorphic set because you can match them up one to one. It's just a translation of form. But languages are not like that. Languages are quirky human inventions, and they're not really even inventions. They're organically developed by humans over time, and they change over time. The meanings of words shift and mutate, and you cannot match any two languages one to one, word to word. It just doesn't work. So translators always have to make judgment calls. They have to examine a piece of text in the original language and then express the same ideas in the target language. And this is actually quite a skill and very tricky. I've found this out when I was doing some translation work, that before I did it, I didn't fully appreciate the difficulty of it. That I could, on occasion, read through a paragraph of Pali and understand in my mind what it was saying, but then I had to really struggle to express it in English. It was quite illuminating to me that that the language is expressing the underlying ideas. It is a form that cannot be just mechanically shifted from one language to the other. You can see this for yourself with something like the online translating things like Google Translate. If you translate a piece of text from a website that's in, say, Russian or German or whatever into English, you'll see it's often very oddly worded and kind of difficult. What exactly does that mean? There's a kind of a game I heard of that illustrates this. You can take a saying or a short piece of text and put it into one of these translators and translate it from through 3 or 4 languages. So you take a text in English. You start with your language you understand. You take a text in English, say you translate it into German, then you translate it into Portuguese, then you translate the Portuguese into Russian, then you translate the Russian back into English, and it'll be something totally different, something really odd. So the mechanical translators are imperfect at best because it's not possible. a machine can't make the judgment calls necessary to express things in a new language. And when we're dealing with a language like Pali and we're translating it into English, there are additional difficulties. One is the great gulf of the underlying cultural matrix. Every language exists in the milieu of a human society, a human culture. And if you're translating, say, from English to French or German, they're pretty close, modern languages. The way people think and understand is not too different. But when you're going back 2,500 years and into a geographically quite different place, the presuppositions will be quite different. Not only is it a long stretch of time, but we're also not, in our Western European-based cultures, we're not in a direct line of succession from India. Our traditions go back to Greece, and there is quite a gulf of understanding between ways of understanding things between the Greeks and the Indians. So this is something that when reading the suttas is to be borne in mind, that the Buddha was speaking in a particular time and place. And very often, if we have some understanding of the underlying history, culture, mythology of India at the time, then the Buddha's words click a bit better. They make more sense because they're in a context. The underlying Dhamma, the truth of the Dhamma, it would be the same across any culture at any time. But if the Buddha was teaching today, he would express things in a different language. He'd use different metaphors and parables. The outward form would be quite different because he'd be dealing with people who had different underlying ideas and presuppositions. Another difficulty with translation is just what I alluded to, the idea of making a judgment call. Because Pali, being a language that was utilized, it's actually designed for transmission of complex spiritual matters. It has a technical precision in terms of mental states and spiritual qualities and practices that English entirely lacks. English is very precise in other things, but in terms of mental states and spiritual qualities, the words are rather vague and ambiguous, the words used in English. And it can be very misleading to take the English words at face value in many cases. So while I don't think it's absolutely necessary to learn Pali to understand Buddhism properly, although I would encourage anybody who is motivated that way, it's quite a rewarding study. But I think it is necessary to acquire a vocabulary of the technical words. If you're studying any field, whether it's electronics or mechanics or mathematics or anything else, you need to acquire a technical vocabulary to properly understand and express the concepts and the components of that field. And the same is true with the Dhamma. Take an example almost at random. Let's say the teaching, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, the teaching of the five khandha, called aggregates in English, generally. Um, and the English words would be the most commonly used ones would be body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. The Pali would be kaya, vedana, sanya, sankara, and vijnana. And all of these words are not quite exactly translated into the common English terms. And as long as you are aware of the underlying meaning, you can adjust your thinking as you read. But we have, for example, to begin. Well, kaya is probably the closest. Kaya is body or form. And there's two words in Pali that refer to matter: rupa and kaya. And rupa, although there's some vagaries in their use, when they're used precisely, rupa means matter in the sense of stuff, right? Under the material substance, and kaya is form. So like you have a drinking glass, the rupa is the silicon molecules, and the kaya is the shape, the cylindrical shape of the glass. So kaya is referring to body as a form. Then we have vedana is feeling. And until this is explained, people misunderstand this entirely, because the word feeling in English is so broad and so vague relative to vedana. We generally use feeling in English to refer to any kind of emotional state. My feelings, or he hurt my feelings, or I have feelings about that. But vedana in Pali is very much narrower in scope. It refers to what we psychologically we could call the hedonic response to a sense impression, meaning that whenever we have a sense impression through the eyes or ears, etc., it's felt. This is the vedana, vedeti. It's felt by the mind as being either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So it's a very much simpler, more rudimentary quality than emotion. Sanya in English is perception, and perception is not bad if it's used precisely, but again, in English, a lot of these words are used in such a loose way that it can be misleading. But sanya refers to a very specific mental process of the way we parse an object of consciousness, so that consciousness is aware of eye consciousness is aware of a field of color, and sanya is what recognizes it as a tree or a house or whatever. Sankara, mental formations. Sankara, the root means to constructed or built, conditioned. So they're formations or constructions produced by the mind. And the word sankara in this context refers to not only thought but also what we would call emotion, intention, volition. So it's quite broad. It's probably a case where the Pali word is broader than the English word. And vijnana, or consciousness, is a particularly difficult one because the English word consciousness is used by different writers and speakers in vastly different ways. Although it can be used precisely to mean the same thing as vijnana, it's not always. It's sometimes confused with thought process, which it has nothing to do with. Consciousness is just the immediate awareness of an object, or vijnana. And then there's the issue of vijnana related to chitta, which is another whole sideline to get into. Chitta being the Abhidhamma term, and it refers to the immediate quality of knowing. Vijnana is used a little more narrowly in the suttas to mean particularly sense consciousness. So these, this is just one example, but we could go through any one of the many lists, things like the Paticca Samuppada and so on, and find equivalent difficulties of finding the precise word. And it's not the fault. It's not the fault of the translators. It's just inherent in the language. It's impossible to be 100% accurate in any translation. It cannot be done. So if you really want to have a deep understanding of the text, you do need to acquire a basic vocabulary of the Pali terms and understand what they mean. A good source book for that is Nyanataloka's Buddhist Dictionary, which is widely available. You can get it as PDF on the internet. That has it doesn't translate every Pali word, but it translates as far as he could manage every technical term that you're likely to come across. So you can look them up in English and see what the Pali is and go to the correct entry, and there'll be a short few sentences discussion of what it actually means, rather than just a bare one-word translation. It's quite a good little guidebook. The particular difficulty in translation from Pali is the amount of verse that we find in the Sutta Pitaka, particularly. Some of the books are entirely in verse, like the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is an interesting case for translation. It's been translated so many times. It's been translated, I don't know how many times, more than 20. There's more than 20 translations of the Dhammapada out there. And some of them are better than others. In some of the translations, you can see the bias of the author. I know there was one very popular translation that was done by a Christian who kind of Christianized a lot of the sayings. Verse is extremely difficult to translate, and from any language, because they're in poetry, it's not just a bare exposition. There's a lot of nuance and metaphor and subtle references. And in Pali verse particularly is a real naughty thing to try and translate, because the the word choice by the original uh, author in Pali will often be um, chosen to make the meter work out correctly. So they'll use obscure words, archaic words, and odd conjugations, on irregular conjugations, and so on. So they can be very difficult to read for someone who's not uh, very fluent in Pali. And I think what happened with the Dhammapada was um, various over the years, various students of Pali, after they'd gained some mastery in translating prose, they decided to try their hand at verse, and the the most accessible collection of verse in Pali is the Dhammapada, so they try and translate it. There have also been other cases where the translator imposes their own ideas onto the text that aren't present in the original. One example was one of the early British translators had this is Mrs. Rice Davies. She had the idea that the Buddha never really taught not self. That was incorrect. That she was interpreting the Buddhist texts through the lens of a kind of theosophist or Upanishadic interpretation. And there's the word atta in Pali, A-T-T-A, as a noun, it means self. And it's also used as a reflexive pronoun. And we have a very similar analogy to that in English, where you can say the word self, meaning a noun, or you can use it in a sentence as a part of a reflexive pronoun, like myself or yourself. And when it's used in that second way as a pronoun, it doesn't imply any metaphysical or ontological statement. If I say I did this myself, it doesn't imply that I believe in a metaphysical self. But this translator would construct the sentence in such a way that atta, when used as a pronoun, would be expressed by her as a noun in English. So it comes out like the Buddha is talking about the self. And that's a kind of an extreme example where an idea is imposed on the text. And most translators are not that deliberately misleading. But as I said, you can't. Even the best translation is always going to be not quite the same thing as the original. So you should bear that in mind, and try and first of all take into account the cultural context, and secondly to back translate in your mind the technical terms, so that you understand when you see the word consciousness, it's talking about vijnana. When you see concentration, it's talking about samadhi, which is a particularly poor translation. I've often spoken about that. And this is, I would say, kind of a historical problem, that there's been an English vocabulary built up going back to the early translators, where word choices for translation get stuck. And the decision was made early on to translate samadhi as concentration, as in the eighth path factor, right concentration. And it's very difficult to change that now. That's kind of established as standard. Someone who does challenge the standard translations is Ajahn Tanisaro, and his translations are widely available on the internet, on the Access to Insight site. Quite a few of his sutta translations are there, and he uses different words for many of the terms. Some of his choices can be just as problematic in different ways. Although I applaud that he's bold enough to strike out a new direction. For example, he translates always dukkha as stress. Dukkha has been translated traditionally as suffering, and many people besides myself have commented on that suffering is not an adequate or a good translation, but no one has come up with a better one, really. And because it's impossible, there is no English word that carries all the same connotations as dukkha. Tanisaro translates it dukkha as stress, and that's actually better than it seems at first glance. But you have to understand the sense in which he's using stress, which he explains at some place, that it doesn't really mean psychological stress, which is how most people reading it assume. It's talking about stress as, you feel stressed out. He says he's talking about stress in the engineering sense, like things bearing and rubbing against each other, like the stress between two members of a bridge. And that actually is pretty close to an understanding of dukkha on the kind of level of dhammas, the kind of abhidhamma level. The first Chinese Buddhists, for the first few generations, they had an interesting approach to translation. They recognized all these problems, and Chinese is even further linguistically from Pali than English is. At least Pali is an Indo-European language, but Chinese is from a quite different linguistic tradition. They translated the Buddhist texts into Chinese, leaving all the technical terms in the original Sanskrit, just phonetically expressed in Chinese characters, so that they were very difficult to read without, for a Chinese reader, they were very difficult to read without prior study, because you had to acquire several hundred words of Sanskrit to be able to read the text. This distance between Chinese and Pali is it occurs to me that it's a similar distance between, say, Thai and English. Thai is also a non-Indo-European language, and we have many books that are translations from the Thai, transcripts of Dhamma talks given by Thai Ajahns, or books written by Thai Buddhists in English, and that's even more difficult to translate adequately than Pali, because it's a non-Indo-European language. I can remember it's like 30 years ago, when I first was taking some interest in Thai Buddhism, and I read some English books that were translations or translated transcripts of Ajahn Mahabua. And they were very difficult to understand and very oddly phrased, convoluted kind of language. And the reason for that, now the newer translations of the Thai stuff is much better, but I have to say, but this was early days. And the reason was that, and it was expressed in an introduction by the translator, that he tried to be as faithful to the Ajahns' words as possible. And his guiding principle was it's better to not understand than to misunderstand. And what he was doing was translating as closely as possible word for word from the Thai. And since the sentence structure of Thai is vastly different than the grammar of English, it made for some odd constructions that were difficult to sort out. But he thought he was being faithful to the master's words. There's also different theories of translation. I've heard Robert Thurman, who's a Buddhist scholar whose particular field is Tibetan Buddhism, and he's translated texts from Tibetan into English. And his theory is that nothing should be left this is the opposite of that old Chinese view. Nothing should be left in the original language. Everything should be translated, and you need to find one English word for each Tibetan word. So this view results in some oddities. For example, his translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a phrase in the Tibetan Book of the Dead that says that the being in between lives is blown around by the winds of karma. And Thurman decided that karma had to be translated by evolution. It's sort of an odd choice, but works maybe in some contexts. But in the phrase in Tibetan Book of the Dead, the being is blown around by the winds of evolution. That's just meaningless, really. So there's always as I said, many judgment calls to be made by the translator. And something has to be compromised. And the two kind of poles to work between are faithfulness to the original and understandability in the target language. And you can see that faithfulness to the original may result in an unintelligible phrasing, as in those early translations of Mahabua, which if one would have to pretty well know Thai and Thai grammar to be able to read the text in English and make sense of it. And the other extreme is when things are so totally rephrased to make them literary productions in English. And I think that the translator Maurice Walsh, who translated the Digha Nikaya, I think he sometimes leans that way, that some of his translations, they're very pretty English, but they're not exactly expressing the phrase in Pali. So I hope this hasn't been completely exhaustive discussion, but I hope I've made you think a little bit about the difficulties of getting at the essence of the Dhamma through translation, and the way we have to try and approach it. Thank you, and I'll let you go on to questions in the chat here. Let's see. I see there's some already up here. I'll start with this one. I found Waters' introduction to Pali to be more of a linguistic study than a guide for learning the language. Can you recommend a better text for learning grammar? Yeah, Waters is a difficult first approach. There are other simpler books that would be be better guides. I don't have the title or the author at hand, but there's a there, there's actually some pretty decent first primers for learning Pali, and then you can pick up Warder later to get uh, deeper into the grammar. Do you have a favorite English Dhammapada translation? I like Narada. Even with perfect language, would we still not struggle trying to infer something inexplainable from the spoken? Yes, that's true. The highest dhammas are just not really expressible in any language. Does Nibbana have bhavanga? No. So is it worth trying to reverse the bias that keeps giving us enlightenment instead of awakening, monk instead of mendicant, etc.? I don't know how far you want to get pedantic about things like that. I agree; those are like the awakening instead of enlightenment, uh, monk instead of mendicant. Well, even monk is not really very good, actually. Um, the I don't know how I don't know how far you want to make a crusade about trying to change those things. I think it's more important that you recognize that they're inexact reflections of the underlying Pali. Have you read Bhikkhu Dhammarakkhita Issues with Pali Literature and its translation? No, I haven't. That sounds like something I would like to read. Is Chitta not in Sutta but only in Abhidhamma? It is very rare in Sutta. It does occur here and there, but it's not used very often. Where do supernormal psychic abilities lie within the khandhas? That would depend on the specific ability. They arise from jhana, but like reading other minds or perceiving the future would be sankhara, but walking on water or walking through walls would be a transformation of kaya. I am interested in translating some suttas into Spanish. Would you recommend learning Pali or going with an existing version in English? That's actually quite a good question. I think if you translate from English into Spanish, you're then translating through two languages, and it's going to add to any distortion. I don't think you would necessarily have to be a master of Pali, but you should probably it would do you would do a better final product if you had some rudimentary understanding of Pali, and you could work from an English. Hopefully my connection is going to be better. I won't be having all these dropouts and things. Is it consciousness without feature in Digha Nikaya 11 Chitta? I'd have to look that up. I'm not really sure. I would think it probably is, but I wouldn't want to, without going to the Pali text, I wouldn't say for sure. Would you have something to say about comparative agama studies by Biko and Nalio? Yes, that's a very, very intriguing field of study. That the idea, for those who are not familiar with it, is that there are a very complete collection of early scriptures in Chinese translation called the Agamas that were originally written in Sanskrit and came from a different early school of Buddhism. I think it was the Dharmaguptakas, but I'm not sure. Then of course, we have the Theravada Pali scriptures. And those are two very early schools of Buddhism, Theravada and Dharmaguptaka. And if you put a passage side by side and compare them, and they're essentially the same, you can be sure that that passage is at least as old as the Second Council, which is when the schools started to diverge. And the Second Council was 100 years after the Buddha's time. So this comparative study is a way of seeing where corruptions and additions and so on crept into the text. If something occurs only in one version and not the other, you can be sure it was added later. So it's a very useful scholarly tool, but it requires to be used. It requires linguistic skill of knowing both Pali and Chinese well, which Anelio does. He's quite a brilliant linguist. Let's see. How do reborn stream mentors know they're stream mentors and proceed on the path to liberation? That is uncertain. I have seen it's not really expressed clearly, as far as I know, anywhere in the original texts, but I have heard kind of two theories on it, or two takes. One is that the person is born into the new life as a Sotapanna immediately. It has that level of understanding. The other theory is that they're not, but they're right on the edge, and very early in their life they'll come across the Dhamma, and as soon as they begin to practice, they'll immediately re-enter the stream and have that level of understanding. That second approach seems to make more sense to me. It's difficult for me to imagine how a little baby or a small child could have that penetration of reality. But who knows? I mean, this is something that's uncertain. Could it be something like an abrupt memory of a past life? Perhaps. I have some trouble finding some texts of the Khuddaka Nikaya like Buddha Wangsa. Is it because they are not translated? The Buddha Wangsa, I'm not sure if it's been translated or not. That's something I don't have in the collection here. I don't think, maybe there's not even an English translation of it. There's a few of the more obscure texts that are either they don't exist or they're hard to find in translation. Okay, so it's getting close to an hour. Maybe we'll wind it up. And special greeting to all my good friends at Birkin. I'm glad you were able to join us for this. Okay, let's